If you haven't joined us before, we are the New York chapter of the Service Design Network. And the Service Design Network is a global organization that hosts events. It hosts conferences. There's a publication. I actually think I have some of them up there called Touchpoint. There are courses that you can take. It's a really rich community of individuals who are passionate about service design, and they have chapters like us all over the world. So we represent New York. We realize we have individuals that are outside of New York as well. So we're super excited to have anyone joining tonight, whether it's your first time or you've been here before, maybe even when we used to do these in person. So welcome back. Welcome for the first time. Feel free to participate in our icebreaker of what's for dinner. And besides that, I will jump in. We're going to have another event. Kathleen, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but we typically have events the second Tuesday of the month. We're doing more right now, just given what we would like to talk about as a community. Frankly, we're really excited to have George here tonight. But typically we meet on the second Tuesday of every month in the evening EST, so 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Yeah, so. I guess for the next event, more details to come. Alex, who's our next event speaker, is actually in the workshop today with us. And so we'll be seeing her next month.
Yes, very excited. All right, and then my final comment before we start talking breakout rooms is please try to rate us if you can. You'll get an email after the event if you have your meetup emails turned on. But we really love the feedback. It gives us a better idea of what you're looking for in the events that we run. We want to make sure we're listening to the community. This was a group really founded from the community, and then eventually we became an SDN chapter. But we really want to hear from you, so please feel free to rate us. You can give us a star rating and then tell us what you have some options of what you didn't like about the event. So without further ado, I want to mention breakout rooms. Many of you may experience or have experienced breakout rooms before. For those of you who have not experienced them, they can be a little bit jarring at first. We're actually going to do a test or kind of an icebreaker with everyone for our first activity. And yeah, you really get kind of thrown into a digital room, to put it simply, and it can take up to 15 seconds to join that. So I would just say be patient with Zoom, and let us know if you need any help, but you'll be put into these groupings with, we're gonna have a lot of activities this evening where you're gonna go into rooms of a smaller group. So right now we have tons of folks looking at 76, so 77. So basically, as we break into these smaller rooms, just have patience with the technology. And if you have a question, let one of us organizers know. We've identified ourselves in the naming convention here. And yeah, so let me prepare. I'm going to stop sharing, and George is going to talk a little bit more about an icebreaker that we're going to do in the breakout rooms while I get us ready to go to the breakout rooms.
Oh, so this isn't, hi everybody, my name is George A. I'm co-founder and director of innovation at Greater Good Studio. I will be your co-host this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much to Natalie and the service design crew in NYC. I think I came out there, I don't remember now, a couple of years ago. I had such a fun time to be with everybody at that event. And I've actually been thinking about ways to be able to do that again. And then obviously everything went nuts. So now here we are trying to do this remotely. For this little mini breakout room, just partly because we want to have some practice and get relaxed. I've always found this thing where if I've ever done a workshop, until there's a breakout room, everyone's kind of uptight. And then after the break room, everyone kind of relaxes. So I kind of want to have that kind of happen early so that we can all kind of get back into it. So the breakout room instructions is you're going to get put into a small room with I think about 3 to 4 people at a time. All we are just asking is for you to introduce yourself, your name, pronoun, whatever you might want to go by, where you are in the world. And one good thing that has happened because of COVID, in spite of everything that's going on, I'd love to try and see if we can be mindful of this very unusual time that we're all in, this time of reflection, this time of pause, this time of being very close, in my case, to my kids constantly. So there are lots of things that one could be perhaps grateful for. If we can just take a few minutes to kind of talk about that with your small groups, and then we'll come back and get started with the workshop. Sound good? Everybody clear? Great. Wonderful, thank you. Natalie,
I am just
do
about.
your magical things.
Yes, magical things are happening. If you haven't managed breakout rooms before, it's quite fun, and I really enjoy it. I'm just making sure I
Well,
don't.
and then I would just say that when you do go to your rooms, could you maybe just turn on your camera so that you can all at least see each other for a little period of time?
All right, so I think I have everyone in a room here, just making sure. We'll switch it up so you can meet some new people throughout. But otherwise, I'm gonna open the rooms now, so be patient with the tech.
Hey, Natalie.
Hey, and it looks like we had some of you guys end up in the main room still, so we can chat with you here or I can chat with you. I think, oh, am I in a room? Maybe I'm in a room. Cool, I'm in a room. Well, yeah, why don't you guys just share? And if everybody can turn on their cameras, that would be great.
I can start. I'm Adriana. I'm calling from Puerto Rico. That's where I grew up and where I was raised and where my parents live. Otherwise, I would be in New York, which
Yeah.
is where I call home.
Yeah.
And I guess along the vein of family time, I've had a chance to spend so much time as an adult with my parents. So I would say that that has definitely been like the positive thing. And my brother and I have like nightly backgammon matches, so that is probably like the cherry on top.
Yeah, I love that. Who else wants to share?
I'm Jackie. Hi. Calling in from Brooklyn. I actually just joined and then went straight into a room, so I'm not quite sure, but I guess we're just saying hi to each other, right?
Yeah, we're just talking about where we are. I actually missed part of what George's explanation was because I was creating the breakout rooms. So say whatever you want to say. You can say where you are. You can talk about anything you're experiencing right now. I think, did he say something you're grateful for? I missed that part. Okay, something you're grateful for.
So I'm Jackie. I'm in Brooklyn. I would say I'm grateful for you guys holding this meetup at such a kind of pivotal time. And yeah, I'm really, I'm somewhat new to this group and kind of getting to know your program. And so far, I really have enjoyed the past couple of sessions I've been to. So yeah, grateful for you, Natalie. You've been really good at setting these things up.
Sure, happy to have you. Thank you. Next. And for those of you who have just joined, we're doing a quick icebreaker, and there are a ton of people in this particular space because it's the kind of hold all people room. So you're not missing anything right now. We're just doing a quick icebreaker. So name, grateful for, next.
I'll go.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Chris, and I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm grateful that the powers that be are finally listening to some of the inequities that have been happening for decades, and that change is happening.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next person. I feel like I have to say next so the person knows they have to. Yeah.
I'm Anna Fitzgerald. I come out of Chelsea, but we left in March. I'm in Flagstaff right now. With the inability to return, I wound up taking a GA-ship with my university, which is University of Arizona. So I'm stationed now in Flagstaff for a year, but I'm grateful for the fact you're doing this because I just landed back in New York after a good several months in Europe, thinking I'd finally be able to get to know you all, only to have it all hit. So
yeah.
Thanks for putting it together.
No problem. And Kathleen, I know, did you come to tell us anything from George? I know you're in a room with George.
Yes. He's like, can we come back?
Okay. So I'm sorry we didn't get through everyone. If you're sitting in this room, this is where we did a breakout room really aggressively in the beginning. And so we're going to bring everyone back now, but I'm sorry we didn't get through everyone. This was just the first kind of fun activity, but we're going to do some more in-depth things in just a moment. So I'm going to close the rooms now and everyone's going to come back and we're going to talk to George.
Sounds good.
So wait for it. It's such a weird, it's like so not here. They're going to slowly trickle back in. All right, we're seeing more and more people. I'll let.
But it's actually much easier than in person. Sometimes in person, you're trying to get everybody's attention, but here it's like, I summon you to be back now.
I know, I have mixed feelings. Yeah, and I'll let you guys know we're still bringing folks back in. Because we did the breakout room so early, George, people were still joining, so we all ended up in this room of like 10 people. So, so that confused some people, but we've learned we now have 84 participants, so I'm going to reshuffle the rooms. I just want to say I am thrilled with the turnout, honestly, especially during this time. I know, again, people are still coming back into the main room, I think. But this is actually breaking some records for us in terms of events, in the sense of we typically have to show. We had 125 show up, and this is substantially more than half who are here and committed to this content. So I'm really excited to have George here. I'm excited to have all of you join. We just did a brief icebreaker. I'll be managing the rooms, make sure everyone gets to be in a room of 4 moving forward. So I'll be quietly working in the background, but I'll start sharing my screen then, George, and take it away.
Great. So thanks again to everyone who's here. I am thrilled to be part of this community, and also just really heartened by the fact that there will be this many people who would want to talk about this. Maybe perhaps because of how much the world is on fire, but it's been on fire for 4 years, so maybe that's another factor. But it seems particularly on fire as of late. So thanks so much for being interested. Let's go to the next slide. So as a quick introduction to myself, there's probably many folks who may not even be familiar with who I am or what I do. So my career started as a designer at a company called IDEO in the Chicago office. And a lot of that work actually centered around doing work in healthcare. And one of the very first projects I got to work on was an insulin delivery device, working for diabetics, helping them through this client called Eli Lilly, designing devices that would help people manage their condition, and essentially using design to help people lengthen their lives. Go to the next slide. And one of the very last projects I got to work on when I was still at IDEO was to work for Kool-Aid, designing packaging that would encourage people to drink enormous amounts of sugary water, and in that case, using design to probably shorten someone's life. This kind of like dichotomy or conflict of interest is so apparent and so common in the design industry. I think we've actually become kind of numb to it. We forget that that's a problem. It's a huge problem, but honestly, I'd even say that when I was doing it, I wouldn't have been able to tell you because it was just sort of like a thing you did. And I realize now that the lack of critical conversation around how compromising it feels to be in this position, but also how compromising it is to use design in this way is very, very common. Let's go to the next slide. So what I often find is that design definitely is changing behavior. So it really behooves us to be asking who is asking for that change. So having a critical discussion about who the clients are and what their intent is, and our complicit role as a designer working on these projects is definitely worth discussing critically. And you may end up finding yourself in moments where you're wondering, what am I really doing here? How am I contributing to the world, good or bad? Next slide, please. So with those types of reflections, it became very apparent that I can't change really my role. And so to take more stock in accounting for my own work if I don't have more control over the work and how it gets made and how it gets brought in. So with my co-founder, we decided to start this company called Greater Good Studio that has a very explicit 100% focus on working with the social sector, which means all our clients are nonprofits, foundations, and government, and that we are real dicks about actually trying to find out who are the types of clients that we work with and what is the rationale behind their actual inquiry. We very critically discuss and review how valid is the thesis they are bringing to us that we then perhaps going to get to work on. Go to the next slide. So because we work on so many different things, and we aren't really subject matter experts in any one particular issue area, we say we use design to elevate voices of people, we work across perspectives, and generate new ideas. That's been probably the clearest way to describe the many, many projects that we get to do. Next slide. And what we practice at our office is this thing called human-centered design. I probably imagine that if anybody here is familiar or actually does this work, could you raise your hand? I'd love to see some hands up. Are you familiar with terms like this? If that's true, you might be very familiar with other similar diagrams or processes that have equally cute little diagrams with colors that describe sort of like the things you do in a particular sequence, which is very, very normal, makes a lot of sense. This happens to be a version of what you've done. But what's interesting, if you go to the next slide, is that there is a embedded conceit. Because it's called human-centered design, you would imagine that because it's centered on humans, it must be good for them. That is not necessarily true, not always. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some examples here. Sorry, if you go back one.
This one.
Yeah, this is an example of the Juul e-cigarette, a product that has had devastating impact across public health, across the country and across the globe. And actually was created by two Stanford grads who, you know, if you take a look at the next slide here, you can see these quotes from the Stanford magazine's alumni magazine, because they're awfully proud of their alum. Monzies and Bowens approached smokers on campus and asked them what they loved and hated about their habit. The complaints were consistent: fear of being seen with a cigarette and paranoia about smelling the smoke on a first date. Isn't that a good insight? Damn. Their first prototypes were ad hoc assemblies of bespoke components and items found on drugstore shelves. If you go to the next slide, they are practicing human-centered design. They nailed it. They did everything that their professors asked them to do. I've actually heard a recent rumor that David Kelly was their advisor, as I'm sure many of those projects are being advised by some of the most prominent design leaders in the world. Yet somehow a product like that with probably good intentions is so clearly and obviously going to have dramatic negative impact on people's public health that I'm surprised that this didn't get flagged as being a real problem. But if you follow human-centered design processes, agnostic of whether or not it should exist, you can create things that were designed very much around behavior change, even if necessarily it's going to be bad for them. If you go to the next slide. What I noticed overall as a critique of the field is that we have such a limited view of what good is, primarily because what good is in design tends to be based around its economic and its sort of corporate needs. And when you design things to achieve certain economic goals as opposed to social goals, you can find yourself designing Juul e-cigarettes and other things like it. Not, I wouldn't say by accident, because I don't think there's anybody being so naive as to say that they didn't know what they were doing. I'm pretty sure that when they have a, was it $3 billion evaluation by Philip Morris, they know exactly what they're doing. But the idea that you might do it and then somehow regret it later on is actually fairly high. So there being a real lack of critical discussion about what good is in our field is sorely missing, which is why I ended up writing this piece in Design Observer. You take a look at my slide. And what I notice in general is that the work that we do, but particularly because there's more and more designers who are interested in doing work in the social sector, wrestling with these issues around power and privilege, what I tend to find is that my conventional training is actually giving me a very conventional view of good. And in many cases, that is actually a real liability, I believe. And when we show up in these complex social issues, when we're thinking about how to help and like have a response to police brutality, my own design, my own like view of the world might be holding me back because of how I was trained. Go to the next slide. So what I want to share with you are some principles that we've learned as a studio on maybe perhaps how good design could be happening, learned from the 100+ projects we've done as a studio, the 9 years we've been in business. And with that exclusive focus on working with complex social issues, we feel like we've had lots of practice now in a way that perhaps not as many design studios might otherwise. I'm more familiar with working in places where doing one design project a year for a homeless shelter, for instance, where you might like give back to the community or do a hackathon to do a type of pro bono project is more sort of the pace. I feel like if you have that type of rhythm, you might not get as much practice at this as we have. So we want to share some of these principles with everybody on this call today. So the first one, if you go to the next slide, these principles go such as this: good design, if you go to the next one. Good design honors reality. Good design creates ownership. Good design builds power. these are terms that actually are not all that new per se, but I would find that they were very absent in my sort of training as a designer. I don't remember ever hearing about them growing up in England, where I went to school. I don't really ever hear about them really being talked about much until really of late. But it's not as though the terms haven't been around, they just aren't really common in our field. But these terms have actual origins. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that where we draw these from are from adjacent disciplines that are equally obsessed with humans and their behavior. Disciplines like anthropology, social work, and organizing. And I think our designers of the future, designers very much like on this call, there's 87 of us. There are likely to be the kinds of designers that I'm looking to learn from. These are the kind of designers that might learn more from these fields than necessarily a lot of the navel gazing that I tend to see a lot of designers that are my age tend to do. So go to the next slide. So for each of these, I have wanted to share. My traditional training, my conventional view says good design honors the future. Can I see a raise of hands if anyone here has ever worked on a future of project? Like the future of commerce or the future of banking or the future of whatever it is. I've done that to death. It drove me nuts. They were fun. Don't get me wrong, they were certainly exciting, but what's so convenient about doing the future of projects is that you get to skip over the now, like the shitty, messy now. Like I would love to just spend my time thinking about a future where there isn't Donald Trump, but like I don't get to do that. I have to like stick through this right now. So what we find is that when we do good design, as in the design that impacts large social systems, if you go to the next slide, we would argue that good design honors reality as it is for today, because so many of the people that we're trying to serve do not have the capacity or the luxury of just like fast forwarding to the future, as perhaps many of the designers might be otherwise trained. And while there's like an attraction, there's like a real sort of novelty perhaps in wanting to look to the future, if you skip over the now, we might miss a lot of really important details. So if you go to the next slide, you see that we learn a lot from people like this lady, Kimberly, when we were doing projects for, in this case, the Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis. We were working on projects around new models of care with regard to the social determinants of health. I'm curious, is anybody familiar with this phrase, the social determinants of health? If you're not, SDOH is sometimes now a new acronym that's been helpful. There's a gentleman, his name is Bon Ku, okay, it's B-O-N, and then his last name is K-U. He's a public health, actually he's a trained ER doctor. He wrote this thing on Twitter just the other day, and he said that SDOH, or social determinants of health, is a cute, it's code, it's public health code for racism. And I remember reading that thinking, oh, damn, that's good. I've been thinking about that all week because I've used this term, social determinants of health, for a few years now, and never noticed how much it is code. Because when you think about how complex social systems work, there are systems in play that keep certain people behind and others untouched. If you go to the next slide, what we find is that in the work that we're looking at here, so much of your ability to have a relationship to a health, like a primary care doctor, actually has to do with your housing. So if your housing is unstable, pretty much everything else is up for grabs. So when we think about honoring reality, projects that we do and the solutions we describe have to accommodate and take stock and honor the reality of having unstable housing, perhaps 30 days at a time, because that's often the cycle of when you can get your like a housing lottery if you're going to look for a shelter. If you go to the next slide. What we generally find is the idea that lived experiences, the kind that all of us have but tend not to talk about, tends to be heavily discounted compared to the learned experiences, the ones that may otherwise constitute where we've worked or where we went to school. Does everybody here perhaps have a LinkedIn profile? I'm curious if you have, if you raise your hand. If you do have a LinkedIn profile, I would argue that most of those things that you put on that profile come from the learned experience category. We tend not to promote or elevate or even discuss the lived experiences. But so many of the people that we serve in the projects we have might have limited learned experiences, but really a real-time expansion and level of expertise in their lived experience that makes them experts in their own lives. And what we tend to find is that because of the discounting that goes on and the sort of de-escalation and the sort of demotion of whether that's expertise at all, we tend to lean on people with letters behind their name and fancy organizations that they worked for. And what that tends to mean is that we have a very narrow band for what expertise looks like in the world, which I think is a huge shame. So what we do as a studio is try to see if we can elevate those lived experiences to be anywhere near on par with the kind of expertise we typically have, which is often by de facto learned experiences. Next slide, please. Natalie, you're doing great. Thanks so much for keeping up with this. My training says good design retains ownership. Man, designers are hell-bent on making sure that there's attribution on everything that they do, and they get really bent out of shape when their name isn't accredited to the right project or the right reference or the right sort of copyright. And not necessarily everybody does this, but I do think there's a lot of designers that have this attention. And what we tend to find, though, is that the more we retain ownership and therefore control over projects, there is perhaps a direct correlation with how much we then hand off to someone to then do the next step. What we'd argue, if you look at the next slide, is that good design creates ownership, which means that it is directly in conflict with what we tend to do and as trained to be comfortable with, because it means that if we want real adoption, real change to happen, we have to design the ownership to be transferred from the beginning and not at the end of the project. Does that make sense? Not when the contract ends, not when the Gantt chart is finished, not when the calendar cycle ends, but there are so many steps that are required in social change that do not fall neatly into any sort of like project calendar, that when you are unbound by like the professional setting of an email being sent to say, okay, hey Joe, go do this particular task, and I can track it in my project management tool. When you're trying to work with community who don't care or don't subscribe to any particular like software for tracking projects, the ownership can falter. And what that means is that then change can falter. So we go to the next slide. When we think about how to enable ownership to happen from the very beginning, we're managing an awful lot of different projects and different project sort of priorities. And one of which, as we described here in the project with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we called it Raising Places. And if you go to raisingplaces.org, you can see the project in its entirety there. We had to design a process from the very beginning where 6 different communities across the entire United States, all time zones from urban, suburban, rural to tribal communities are all included in the process where they are driving the change. It requires an awful lot of like decoding of what we learned as designers and how we think about how change typically happens. If you go to the next slide. In many cases, we have to find and create opportunities where the simple invitation to contribute doesn't get reneged, as so often happens in projects in the past. I'm curious, if anyone's ever been part of like a local community change or ever been a part of a town hall meeting where they've had the local community happen? If you have, I used to work at the Chicago Transit Authority. I would argue that they are like a masterclass in giving shitty town halls, because what typically happens is that you go and attend and you simply are there to hear news that becomes news to everybody else. You just heard it earlier than everyone else. No actual change occurs, no discussion occurs, and it's simply the conveyance of material as opposed to actual discussion. So knowing that that's the norm, and we're starting in that place of almost like a trust deficit, we had to design and engineer every engagement for community to feel the opposite of that and feel like they can actually have control. Because in reality, and this is constantly true, we are based in Chicago. We cannot sustain the long-term game of a project for change in the community because we go back to Chicago. This guy with this accent showing up in Montana is going to get laughed out the door, or more likely people will just simply not show. So knowing that that is the case, we had to enable an entire community to be their own design team with the lightest footprint from our team in Chicago. That takes a lot of care, and it really brings up questions like, well, what is our role? And what is our job now? So it's very delicate. We go to the next slide. And next slide again. What we found as an observation is that people adopt the change that they are a part of making, which requires that there has to be a real design and thought and care over how are they going to be engaged so that they feel like they are actually a part of it themselves. I'm curious to know if anybody here has ever like woken up to an email and found out, boom, suddenly they're on a new project, or boom, they're now part of a new, completely new organization overnight, and welcome to your new manager and your team. Or suddenly you wake up, find out you just don't have a job anymore. It would feel very different, I think, if those emails had been written by you or written with you, or perhaps even like co-written by you and a team, because that kind of adoption we see to be so dramatic of a change that it requires a kind of care that so rarely happens. We go to the next slide. Lastly, my training says good design hoards power. I don't think it's fair to necessarily say this is something that only designers do, but I think a lot of people sort of have this negotiation of relationship with power, which we were talking about at length. The idea that power has to be something that you hoard because you feel like if in order for you to have any, you have to take it from someone else. And if anybody else has it, they have to have taken it from you. It's very much a zero-sum game. I think sadly that is the normative way of discussing it. I would love to contest that is, I've not found that to be true. I found it to be perhaps true in the short term, but in the long term, I find that it is a lot more generative and regenerative. So in our studio, and I think in my own personal practice, we're trying to do what is in the next slide here. The principle of good design builds power. We're looking for ways to distribute the power that we have, redistribute it to those who have less of it, and actually being incredibly conscious about where the power lies at any moment. So this discussion of power, I think, is apropos to certainly the workshop, but also right now, if you look at the next slide, what I tend to find is that designers are actually pretty absent in their understanding around power. And I think it's because design education as a whole is completely absent in its discussion about it. This was one of the very first pieces I got to write about this topic here, and it really helped me understand, perhaps expand my own thinking around how complicit I was and how much my hands were stained by the fact that I, as a design educator, never knew any better, partly because I had been taught by people that were previous to me and they hadn't been taught any better. Generally, designers, because we work in a professional services field, are beholden to our clients. So to discuss power would mean we would be discussing clients. Now we discuss them, sure enough, to maybe say, how do we get enough money out of them? But we aren't discussing power to say, should we work with this client? And how do we disrupt that relationship? We don't tend to talk about that. So what I found was that by writing about this piece, it helped me understand how do we change the pipeline of teaching design so that more and more designers are armed with this question of how and where does power lie? If you go to the next slide. Let's talk a little about what power is. So power tends to be discussed and maybe perhaps thought about in this like really large systems level, sort of like world leader level, as opposed to thinking about it like the much more intimate and much more sort of like a one-to-one level discussions that I think is a lot more helpful. So if you look at this definition, there's the easiest one I could find on the internet, which just simply says, power is the ability to affect an outcome. So if you think about, if you've ever said out loud something, so like, I wish this was true, and it happens, actually that's kind of a measure of how much power you have. If on the other hand, you've said stuff out loud and it didn't happen, that's a measure of how little power you have at that moment. So it changes. If you look at the next slide though, another observation I think is so critical to understand alongside knowing what power might be is how uneven it is. So the idea of there being something, if anyone's familiar with this term, or people may have said, man, there was some really weird power dynamics in that meeting. Has anybody been to a meeting where that was described? I've never found the term power dynamics to be very like visually helpful. I never understood what it meant other than, wow, that just sounds like a terrible meeting. But to know what it means is to I think it's clearer to say there was power asymmetry, as in there was an uneven distribution, or in this case, lopsidedness in how power was distributed in that meeting or room or that setting. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see an actual quick visualization is simply this triangle. But I love to see, has anyone here ever started a project and at the very first like whiff of hearing it or getting an email, you go, oh my God, I'm screwed. I'm never getting out of this alive. Like the budget doesn't make sense. The timeline, it seems so like nonsense. The team, like who are all these people? And like, why the hell am I the one doing this? Anybody have that? That might describe my 7 years at IDEO constantly. And in many cases, and I think this has taken me a long time to get to this point where I'm clear about asking about it. I used to blame myself. And I think as a person of color working in a white America, I blame myself a lot without realizing, as I might describe here, I was set up to fail. Now, I can take personal attribution for things I screwed up by myself, but realizing that I was in an asymmetric relationship to those with power helps me better understand, oh, that's why I felt paralyzed. Huh, that's why I couldn't get out of it. Oh shit, that's why it's happening again. And I've been able to use this lens of power to reflect upon many, many past interactions that I've had with along my career and realize, that actually helps me better diagnose what was going on. I mean, certainly I could have done things better in some cases, but actually it helps me go, okay, now I get it. And it's helping me now project into future situations. How do I not make people feel like they're on the sharp end of the asymmetry? How do I not be on the wide end, squeezing them when I ask of this request or send this email or have this conversation? It's been really helpful to help me sort of like reinterpret the world. Now, if you take a look at the next slide, I want to share with you some classic asymmetric relationships. There are a bunch. We could do like a multi-hour discussion on just this. So law enforcement with detainees, as we know, this is part of the reason why so many people are really upset right now. We have massive asymmetry between those two forces right there. Doctors and patients, employees and employees, funders and grantees, teachers and their students, landlords and renters, local government, community, and leadership and frontline staff. You might find yourself actually, depending on where you look at this, you might find yourself on the wide end here, you might find yourself on the sharp end here, that's fine. Now, what's funny is that for us as a studio, we were like, yeah, let's find the man. We thought that Greater Good Studio was all about being aligned with the sharp end, with that right-hand side. But because we're a professional design team, guess where we actually landed on this spectrum? You go to the next slide. It's embarrassing to admit how far along we have to be aligned with those with power. Does that make sense? We do not get projects, we don't get paid, we don't have contracts, we don't do anything without having massive alignment with those with power. Do you see how fraught this is and how potentially incredibly problematic it might be that when we do a project, we might end up working not only in the shadow of someone else's power asymmetry, but when we show up, we actually might make things worse, which is why we are so critical of trying to work out, should we do this project at all? Not can we, not how do we, not when do we, but should we? It's critically important that designers are more familiar and comfortable asking that larger question, because our role, when it shows up, we often get used. I'm talking dead serious here. We are going to get used by people in power for change. And while they might ask us, yeah, we want to do public engagement, or we want to do a new way of doing things, you're going to have to do some real serious sniff tests to find out whether or not this sounds right. And is the history of that organization or that client of yours have any precedent of doing work like this in the past? Or do they have more likely precedent of cheating people of this social contract and using you in return? Here's the thing, most people in power and most organizations will be there in perpetuity, but you will get used and spat out from this process. You will be the one that gets stained by this like fake public engagement, and people will remember you because you had the face of it. They're not going to remember the Catholic Church. They're not going to remember that bank. They're not going to remember Gates Foundation because they're just like around perpetually. It's really scary. If you go to the next slide. When we looked at this project, and we really struggled to find really any project where we felt like we were shifting power, because I think shifting power might be the hardest possible thing that anybody can do as a designer. So when we looked at an example here, we looked to try to see if we can find something, and we think this could be close. The Metropolitan Tenants Organization in Chicago is a renters' rights advocacy organization. They're fantastic. And if you're ever a renter in the Illinois, in the state of Illinois, you may actually have called them already, but we help build some mobile tech. If you look at the next slide, that helps renters navigate the often fraught negotiation they have with their landlords around how to get resolution for issues. Now, what's amazing is that the MTO put into legislation into Illinois a law that says a tenant is allowed to self-remedy a solution for themselves if the landlord won't fix it. As in, they can use their own rent money to fix and hire somebody to fix the issue that the landlord won't. And that information is usually completely opaque and hidden, but we surface it through this technology that we help build. It's fantastic. But it does allow that perhaps we could say, maybe once, we try to build power. So go to the next slide. This last observation, we said that the people with the least power are often closest to the problem, which means that there are those who are in greater proximity to issues, then often in the case of me, much closer than I am. And my lack of proximity to the problem puts me at a deficit. Whether or not I've had experience doing processes like this, a project like this, or no matter how way I've worked in the past, my lack of proximity gives me insulation from that lived experience. That means in many cases, I don't know a goddamn thing about this problem. But because we're designers, we get told we are awesome all the time and so innovative and all this blah, 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 that I think actually the insulation is the problem itself. So when we and when you perhaps go and work in these complex social issues, look for people who have greater proximity and start from a place of learning from them and trying to see how can I get closer to it because you are the daily expert. If you go to the next slide. Here are some sort of questions I'm gonna ask for you to do and maybe discuss in your breakout rooms in a second. Number one, we value learned experiences, but discount lived experiences. Go to the next slide.
Sorry, I was getting ready for breakout rooms, got excited.
How might your work honor reality? These are mostly rhetorical. I'm not totally sure if I'm asking you to like have answers. I just kind of want you to have them in your mind as you think about this. Next question. Next slide, sorry. Number two, people adopt the change that they're a part of making. So if you go to the next slide, how might your work create ownership? And then number three, the people with the least power are often closest to the problem. So how might your work build power? So if you go to the next slide, I'll give you some instructions. Yeah, you can always reach me there, sorry. So this is what I want to ask. In order for the breakout room to kind of work, I'd love for you to maybe like sit with your group of 3 to 4 and just maybe reflect upon what you heard and read. See if anything left you with some questions for yourself, left you with any moments of wondering like, how do I do things differently? Or even just to say like, I don't agree with what George said. Any reactions, I'd love for you to be able to give some time to kind of respond in your small groups. And if you wish, develop a question, then we can kind of talk about it before going to our next big section, which is facilitated discussions around power and privilege. Does anybody have any questions about this next section? We'll probably give about 5 minutes for this little breakout room. And I want to give a shout out to Eve Tuck, who I don't know, but I wish I could meet. I have a huge crush on her. She just seems like such a badass. She's written other pieces that apparently I'm not that familiar with. I have a question here. Isn't lived experience a learned experience? Kind of. I mean, certainly you could argue that perhaps all lived experiences are learned to a degree, but I'm trying to make the distinction between lived experiences that don't require institutional support, or in some cases require working at a firm or having access to schools. There are a lot of individuals who don't have those types of things, and their lived experiences tend to be all they have. And I would argue that that's something that is worth valuing. Question, how do you prepare the way or gain the license from stakeholders? I think this is maybe something we could talk about as the whole group. Yeah, provoking a shift in power. Yeah, let's talk about that as a larger group, or maybe at least discuss it in your small groups. I think these are the kinds of questions that I think will be really rich for the whole room to discuss. Any other questions right now? I think Leonard Shane's one more comment. Oh yeah, this is great. So I think have these discussions in your groups. This is exactly what we're hoping to get. Natalie, are you good on the breakout rooms?
Got it. So unless you
Okay.
just quickly joined and re-entered the meeting and screwed it up for everyone, no. You should all be in a group of 3 to 4 in just a few seconds. So I'm gonna open the rooms now.
Hi, Greg. Oh, I can't hear you guys. You're all on mute.
It's
I was
my,
on mute.
yeah, they
Yeah.
muted us.
I think maybe It's the mute. Okay.
It's like a mute on entry. It's a default.
It is. I know. There's a lot of like really deep settings into Zoom. But I think this is better because if someone accidentally, like I don't know if Greg did this.
Oh, right.
Then I can see you and
Exactly.
while they get confused.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was funny when I really want to try that again. George's do a breakout in the beginning, but what was funny is we still had like 10 people joining when we did it.
Sorry,
So
we were so quick to do
it was funny because they were like
rushing.
They were excited, and then it was like, well, hi, and there were like 15 of them. I'm like, we're not going to get through intro, so we did 3, and I was like, oh, we're in the main room, and they're like, what's happening? No, it was funny more so because we hadn't. I'd rather try it and know, and that's like each one of these we've done like at least one new thing, and so I'm loving it because Did Kathleen go into a room?
I don't know. She'll still be there.
I don't know what happened.
Or maybe she had to drop. I don't know, but.
I also feel that just having done the breakout, it really helped feel like, oh, everyone's here now. Just like just a little tiny buffer actually helped me at least.
Oh no, she's in the, I don't know how to put her into the main room. I'm gonna go get her. I'll be right back.
Wow, this is very advanced, like venturing in breakout rooms and catching people. Cool. So do you do this talk often, or is it something you prepared? I mean, you prepared this before this.
Yeah, I've given this talk before. Yeah, I think I spoke 50 times last year, and I spent 60 days traveling in 2019, and it nearly killed me. I'm not sure if I ever want to do that again.
Yeah,
it wasn't maybe this talk every time, but I've given this talk before. Yeah.
Okay, so not always this talk. Yeah, 50 is a lot. I mean, I probably gave like around 20, 25 public speaking.
That's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, before all this started, I was traveling like 40 flights per year, 35, 30. Yeah, that's a lot. Because it's true. I mean, for me, I mean, I'm from Europe, so it was Europe and then Canada and here. So it was. So I mean, you know, that's sort of a point to reflect in our industry. I think, you know, all this needs to be reshaped in the way. I mean, you know, even once we start flying again, I mean, that it doesn't make sense anymore. And I'm not even from a generation where we were kind of like crazy travel. You know what I mean? Like people in the 90s, like imagine an executive in the 90s. I mean, just traveling like every day. Like there was no consciousness about these, and but even our generation, it's just unnecessary and too much. And so we need to find ways. It's not directly related with power dynamic, but you know, in a sense, I don't know. It's just like redistributing resources, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I gave this talk and workshop, a little shorter version of it, 3 times to a client that's in San Francisco over the last few months. And usually that would require like a 3-day commitment for me. Travel there for a day, get ready, do the workshop, then fly back red eye. And the shortest I could do was like 3 days. And I would charge them for all that time. And now I've done it 3 times without any of the travel, still same fee. And it's now just 2 hours. It's like, I don't know why I'm traveling and dicking around for all that time. I can do it in one night now. It's amazing.
Exactly. And I mean, you know, like then if you build this into your business model as a company or as an agency, as whatever, then like all of a sudden you have budgets that you can dedicate to maybe things that are maybe more relevant and they have more impact, you know. So then you start kind of switching the perspective.
Yeah, so, the whole calculus is changed because, you know, I have 3 kids, and the kind of toll it's taking that it did take last year on me and my family was really significant. I'm probably never going to do anything like it again.
Imagine.
And then with COVID being here, what I realized is actually just not so much the cost, but actually how cheap I was treating my time. I was discounting so much and basically not factoring in the 3 days that I was giving up my power to this client and saying, it's fine, I can take the toll. It's okay. My family is consumable. And it's shit. It's a shitty thing to do. And I realized that if I can do still get the same value out with a 2-hour phone call or 2-hour Zoom, minus the 72-hour added cost for nothing. What the hell was I thinking? you know?
I hate to
Yeah,
interrupt.
no, I know.
Well, good. 46 seconds for them to come back. I gave them 7 minutes. Is
Yeah.
that acceptable? Is that
That's
good?
great. And then how are we doing on time? I'm a little
I mean,
confused.
I'm a little bit like, I've been so focused on the sharing in the breakout rooms, I have literally no idea. So maybe
It's
Antonio can-
5:52 right
It's
now.
Yeah, it's 6:52 here. So
So we have an hour and 8 minutes. Is that
yeah,
right still?
yeah,
Good.
yeah.
Good.
I
Good.
mean, a little bit less if you wanna maybe.
No,
for experience.
we'll
Yeah.
go to the end, I think. Natalie, did that sound okay? I don't know if you've seen that talk before.
No, I haven't. I'm loving it.
Okay.
I'm sending
Yeah,
them
it's
a
great.
message about bringing
Everybody's happy on different social media. Everybody's like
Oh, really?
already talking about that.
Oh, good. I can't keep track of any of that stuff. I'm just hoping that people are like,
Oh no,
I see
it's
a
more
few
like
people nodding.
people that contact me privately, like
Okay.
friends, colleagues, and people from the community that somehow, ping me directly. So, let's see if
Wonderful.
there's something in the
Welcome
chat
back,
people
everyone.
actually.
Welcome
So many
back.
beautiful faces. Yay.
George, do you want discussion now or do you want slides? 'Cause
Yeah, no, some discussion would be great, actually. Now, there's an awful lot of people here, obviously coming back.
yeah,
It would be great if, so here's a couple of instructions. I was going to maybe just ask for a couple of folks to maybe reflect on what they heard and maybe have share a question that they developed in their rooms. If you do speak up, just because there's so many screens, I'd love it if you could tell us your name and where you're from, and then speak out your question, if that's okay. Hi.
I'll say something. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Oh,
Tell us your
okay.
name.
Oh, I'm Dana, and
Hi, Dana.
I'm outside of Dallas,
Hi.
a suburb of Dallas,
Welcome.
and we kind of zeroed in on that power, the topic of power, that people with the least power are often closest to the problem, and then there was how might your work build power. So we were just thinking about that, and one of the ideas is being an influencer to the person who has, the power. And I was saying, I just gave a few examples, but that in itself is powerful.
Yeah, I think it's more norm to talk perhaps about how little power folks have, but I think it's maybe unfair to sort of discount the power you do actually have. And I think a lot of us on this call perhaps have access to more than they might be told or regularly reminded of. And I think all of us do have a modicum of power that we can influence and shape and change. I know that conversations that a lot of folks are having, particularly around this police brutality, is causing a lot of white colleagues of mine, people that I'm in community with, to have discussions around what the power that they have and they might be able to influence. So I think that's healthy. But I actually think maybe one of the largest questions I don't tend to hear much about is why do not white people talk to their parents about why they were never asked these questions? That I think is something I'm really sorely missing. I know that I probably still haven't had a conversation with my mum, who is anywhere from like slightly racist to overtly racist. And I don't look forward to having that discussion with her. But I imagine a lot of my peers, while I think it's valuable to have conversations with their kids, which I think is great, I think actually having conversations with their parents about why did we never talk about this would be healthy. And how come that was so taboo? Because I think it will undo and sort of unwind some of the things that are so baked into what we identify as being white, and therefore have access to the kind of power that we've been talking about tonight. Thanks, Dana. Can I hear from maybe somebody else? If you maybe introduce yourself, I can try to find you.
I'll say something. It's Aurelia. I'm from the
Hi.
New York area. I usually
Hi.
go to the pizza parties every month.
Yes, good.
We talked about ownership. I had done a hackathon. We first said a couple of things came up, and all the designers just quickly booted up their Creative Suite, Sketch, all the things that we pay for. But what we were doing was for a gardening co-op in Philly, and they obviously didn't have any of those programs. So we had to back it up. And right now, 6 months later, they asked us, we have to redo everything into Figma. So we need to give them the power to own it themselves and keep going. And then they can use all these logos and things that we did, and you know, then it's all theirs. So, but right now, us 5 designers are redoing all the marketing and branding that we did for them 6 months ago. So that's to give them ownership. We also talked, really interesting, we talked about the equality that remote collaboration has done, like working in Mural. And that, of course, people with mobility challenges are now part of our talent pool. So, you know, so that was great. But then one of my other teammates here on the call said, but I'm a student and I don't have the internet bandwidth.
Right.
And, you know, for remote learning for kids in school in New York, you know, if you have a great Wi-Fi and you're paying for it, your parents are rich, that was fine. But some of the kids in the projects, they don't have unlimited data. So they literally lost a month of school because they just couldn't sign in to the Google Classroom.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of phenomena that I think COVID is exposing. It's not as though those issues weren't already there. It just became a lot easier to spot because of the way in which it kind of stress tests the system. I actually wanted to just go back to the idea of like the software you use. We had a project where we worked with a very small local nonprofit to us in Chicago, and we asked at the upfront, what software do you have? Because we knew that the issue that you were going to run into was likely to become a problem. And they said, we only have Microsoft Office. And we thought, oh dear God, what does that mean? So then we ended up realizing we had to design everything in PowerPoint from the start. But then once we got further, we realized they actually don't even know how to use PowerPoint. So then we ended up rescoping to include a PowerPoint training to then use the thing that we built. So when we start thinking about our work as not just simply a thing or a product or an output, but rather think of it as a tool, it changes our relationship to what the thing is that we're making, because the tool requires an understanding of how is it going to be used. So if the things that we produce are outputs not simply to go like be placed in places, but rather how and when and how often can it be used, questions around its usability then be put back on us as a design team to figure out, because I don't think any client that we know of would know to ask those questions, but will know to ask them once it's too late.
Right. So you don't. So that's why we're going back 6 months later and rebuilding.
Yeah, which is unfortunate, but also like I think that sounds like a great lesson. Thanks for sharing it with us.
Yeah.
This has been so helpful. Thank you so much for everyone for digging into these things and also digging in with your small groups. Natalie, can I ask you help and maybe share screen again this next section? So we have about an hour now to get into to kind of do some work. And while I think the themes that are brought up in the sort of upfront talk will come up again and again and again, I want to have a little more of a directed conversation for you and your small groups around these topic areas around power and privilege, but specifically asking some questions that will be a little more pointed with our own personal relationships to power and privilege. So before sort of starting with, I want to acknowledge the work that Akai Winwood has done for me. She runs something called the Rockwood Institute in the Bay Area. If she hadn't asked certain questions of me when I was exposed to her work, I don't think I'd be here right now, but it like cracked my head open at the time, and I've been trying to put it back together again ever since. So big shout out to Akai Winwood. If you go to the next slide, I want to sort of ask some questions around the power that comes from our identity. And I'm going to be asking that for all of you to do some inquiry that's inward. These next questions are annoyingly the same question 3 times over. So I get it, but take a look and try and see if we can pick our way through this. Okay, so if we look at the next slide. Power from identity. So what identity do you claim is the first question. Natalie, could you maybe get these ready to go so they can show up as a chat in the breakout rooms later on? What identity do you, oh, can you go back, sorry? Go back a slide. What identity do you claim? Then what identity was placed on you? And then what identity did you earn? It's basically the same thing, but also it's critically important that they be interpreted differently because it allows you to actually ask, who am I? And where do I draw my power? It's asked of this in a slightly awkward way, because if you ask these questions of yourself a week from now, or a month from now, or a year from now, your answers will likely be very different. It's perfectly okay that they change. And it's also perfectly okay that your answers are different for each of these probing sort of like stimuli. They're not expected to be fixed in any way. But I think it's worth sort of inquiring for yourself, sort of what is my response? And actually even noting whether or not I've even thought about it before. So to kind of give you a little clue, and I'm going to do this one time, if I were to respond to these questions, I would say the identity that I claim is that of a professor. I never got my master's, and yet I teach at a fancy school where I do grad classes. And despite my lack of training, I feel like I'm like going to get caught out anytime, but I still get to teach, which is great. The entity that was placed on me, that of a heterosexual, able-bodied Asian man with a British accent. I did nothing for these things, yet I have all of them. So I think it's worth noting that I'm interpreting it in that way. And then the identity that I earned, I might say that of a dad, because I work really hard at it, and I think it's really hard to be one, particularly today. But everyone is allowed to interpret these absolutely any way they wish. That's why I'm trying not to like overly go on and on about my own interpretation. These are very open-ended for you to interpret. You can focus on just one, you can focus on all three if you wish. But I think for you and your small groups, I would love for you to take a little time to think about it. Now, before we do the breakouts, I'm going to give everybody maybe a minute or so just to contemplate what that might be. You can write down some notes before going into the breakout rooms and having that discussion. While we give that minute, can I see if there's any questions right now?
It might be good if they write down the questions as well, because while I'm making the breakout room, I know you said to put them in the chat, but I want to make sure I make the breakout rooms right. So if you guys want to copy these questions down, take a screenshot, whatever helps, and then of course questions, definitely questions.
I also put them in the chat, so you'll be on the side in case anybody didn't have them.
Who's speaking now?
Kathleen.
Sorry, it's Kathleen. Yeah. I also put them in the chat.
Wonderful, thank you. Actually, what identity was placed on you?
And I'm recreating the rooms.
So while we're getting ourselves ready with the breakout rooms, does anybody have any questions or wondering like sort of if they're just unclear about what the instructions are?
Can you clarify a little more on placed on you?
Yeah. Shall I just talk? Yeah, so it could be things that feel as though you were born into, or the context in you were born in would be a way of interpreting placed. It feels slightly different than claim and earn, because both of those seem a little different than, you could say what identity was given to me, was put on me, or was I born into? Those seem like similar interpretations. Also, nobody can do this wrong. You can't screw this up.
So when you say identity, Felipe, when you say identity is placed on you, do you mean like from work?
Sure.
Or just what you think in general, how people perceive you?
That might be helpful because I think it's helpful to start to think, how are people interpreting me when they don't know me at all? But knowing that sort of, you can even use this example of the Zoom, how like little information I get about all of you. But if I look at your tiny little like thumbnail, some of the answers in that question of what identity was placed in you are coming through to me looking at your thumbnail. Does it help explain it?
Yes, thank you.
Like it's very crude and limited, but that's kind of what a lot of people use when thinking about those identities.
It's Aurelia. Can you explain the difference between claim and earn, maybe? They seem so similar.
I could, but I'm not going to. I'm going to let you tackle that one. They are awfully similar. I don't mean to be annoying. I just think it's okay if you can interpret it both ways, or any which way. You can even say they're the same and leave it at that. You can't do it wrong. I'm only being annoying just because I don't want to interfere too much. Any other questions before we break? Okay, so Natalie, can you do your magical things, please?
Breakout rooms starting now.
Thank you.
I'd love to facilitate a discussion now, and just try to see if we could have an open chat with the format that we have, almost as though you came back from your breakout rooms. Because I think if Natalie, if we lost everybody, I think we might be right on time still, and look like nothing happened. So we're going to be super cool about it and not even worry about it. Okay.
Okay.
Really, thanks for the questions there. Yeah, what identity do you claim? What identity was placed on you? What identity do you earn? I'd love to hear from folks if they're willing to maybe share what came up for them from the breakout room that we all just went to.
I think I'll go. Hi, my name is Pauline, and this has been actually a very interesting time for me because I was born in Kenya. I'm in the majority, came here in the United States, in New York now, and I'm an international. I'm a designer, so I always see myself as just as a designer. But moving to the United States, I had to learn how to be Black. So the identity placed on me was to be Black. It was not something I've grown up with. I also have to learn how to become a minority, and that has really been, and I never really thought about it until what has been going on in the last 2 weeks in terms of the racial discussion and trying to understand where I fit in, even if I've learned from a historical context the experiences of the Black culture here. It's been quite interesting for me is that I sympathize and I empathize, but it's a much bigger discussion than I really need to self-reflect. And the last part of me is what do I claim? What was the last part of the question? And what have I earned is that I am a designer working in science, and I'm an explorer, and so people see me as that, now a service designer. So I think my identity is about design and more about who I am as a Black person or as my race. But those two go hand in hand. So the decisions that I've made about me I can't ignore both, but I think those are the most two powerful identities about myself.
I'm curious, Pauline, if you could speak to a little more about the context in which you were in before versus the context you're in now, and the impact it had on that, maybe that part of the question of was placed on you, the identity was placed on you. Would you say that the identity was placed on you in the previous context? How did that land then?
Oh, actually, I think in my previous context, I think that's probably one of my most powerful assets is that I have an international lens. I am able to see things from a very different lens, and working for global corporations, I've always been the person who has a dichotomous point of view. So I think I have seen that as my asset, and I really don't dwell in it but that's not something that people see. I have to talk to it when I'm in conversations and I understand the cross-cultural communication, and I have to translate, and they say, oh, you get it. And so that I'm also understanding what that privilege means, because that's another aspect of privilege that has put me ahead of others, because I can speak the language there and I can also speak another language here.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm curious if others would maybe speak to what came up for them in response to those questions that were prompted to the larger room. I'm curious to hear if,
I'll jump in.
Yes.
Hi.
What's your name?
Cynthia from Brooklyn. How are you?
Hi.
So the identity I claim is as a Colombian woman. The identity, I forgot the language. The identity I've earned has to do with my professional career. I'm a professor and now in a leadership role in a design school. And the identity that's placed on me, and the reason why I came to this session, is as a white, Caucasian woman in the U.S. or from a European country, or. And what's interesting with this exercise, George, and I really appreciate it, is the reflecting on which of these identities give me power and privilege. in which identities do I try to, am I ever hiding if I try to overclaim, but I'm a Latina? And where I really confronted this was in a workshop many years ago called Undoing Racism, where it became very clear that it doesn't matter what identity I claim. I mean, it matters, but it matters most in terms of my privilege in the world, the identity with which I present. And it's been really important, I would say, to come to terms with that. And so I appreciated this exercise to kind of think through all of these layers of identity, power, and privilege.
Yeah, I think what's kind of mentioned in both of the last two speakers was the idea that there are judgments being made of you long before what you say gets registered, what you do gets heard, what your work is seen as value, and that not knowing that those things are registering before and like essentially acting before you get a chance to really prove anything of your value or your worth means that those judgments are being done automatically, which seems so deeply unfair, but at the same time it is constantly true. Not only is it unfair of yourself, but it's also true that you might be doing it to others as well. So when you have a system that requires that judgment to have dramatic impact on some people and not others, I think it sort of highlights just how systemically unfair and sort of not only like, not just wrong, but just like how screwed up things have been, because it relies on therefore on a fictional hierarchy of human value. It requires that there is an ordering and a rank of sort of scale that allows some individuals to progress and not others. And I think probably most of us could probably tell which ones where we stood on that rank. We could even probably rank and order everybody on this call right now, just using the thumbnails. And I think what's so tragic is that how intimately familiar we might be with that rule, yet at the same time know it's wrong. Like it's not as though we can't deny its existence, but at the same time we can still acknowledge that it doesn't seem really fucking fair at all. So this is fantastic. I think this is exactly the kind of conversation I was hoping to get. I'm conscious of the time. Maybe if there's one more person that would like to speak up, that would be great.
Hi, George. My name is Felipe.
Hi, Felipe.
How you doing? I was wondering if I could ask a question that maybe isn't related to these topics. I mean, it was something that you mentioned earlier about your design. So how would could you talk a little bit about how you would redesign maybe design schools? Because and I'm asking because I didn't go to design school. I'm more of a what people call self-taught designer. And in my group earlier, we talked about the elitism of design schools and these master programs that kind of are barriers to entry into things like civic design and civic and social, where it's really hard to see, you know, creating products, services through a lens of people who are underserved is really difficult if you're coming from this sort of background of having more of a privilege. So I was wondering your thoughts on that, and from your earlier, when you were talking earlier about like how you might change that, or your opinions about changing the way schools.
I mean, I think it relates to this topic because it's something that where I would not identify as a designer. I can do a really good impression of one at this point. And for most terms, I would just say it because it's easier and quicker to get through it rather than have to describe I'm actually an engineer and I'm more of a researcher. And I think I can play a good impression of one on TV. I can speak like one, I can think like one, but I feel like I'm still missing a lot of the core disciplinary skills. And I only say it because I worked along some of the best designers that I've ever seen in my life and probably in the world. And I know I'm not them. It's like the difference between like I'm learning to swim like a paddle float when you're sitting next to people who are Olympic swimmers. You can just tell that there's a mechanical and totally experiential difference between me and the folks I learned. At the same time, what I find to be so troubling about design as a discipline is there's so much gatekeeping and there's such a rigid structure around making sure that people who don't feel as though they are actual designers, okay, it helps them. It helps people who are the gatekeepers to make you feel bad. So Felipe, I'm sorry that you feel excluded, but it's not just you, it's on purpose. Because what it means is that people who are paid as designers continue to get their fees. So the exclusivity that comes from being a fee-driven business requires that there are people who feel comfortable claiming it and those who do not. So you are on the sharp end of that power asymmetry, unfortunately. I also think it's true that those who are within design schools and professors continue to perpetuate this asymmetry because it behooves them to make sure that there's exclusivity around who gets in and who doesn't. Now, in of itself, you could say, well, that's a standard, but I find that at the core of standards is a white centrality that says that in order to be standard, a good standard, so much of it rests on a white European male, practically German norm. Is very, very problematic. So the idea of trying to work out where is this centered, you should ask of any design school. And the answer will be, I have no idea what you're talking about, other than, well, you know, the classics. And what that classically means is that it means that we have a very narrow band for what good is and a very narrow band for what excellent is. So I've written about this in a couple of different places, but I feel like, Felipe, you are a product of a set of questions that unfortunately the discipline so rarely asks of itself. You are further ahead than the discipline in that regard. So I would not take any shit from anyone when it comes to doubting your skill set, actually. I think mostly what you might be lacking is practice and having the feedback mechanism, but we wrap all that up in all of this shrouded bullshit about what it means to be a designer, that if it would help, I can give you the feedback that you need. We can set up, you know, a regular session to just talk about your work. That would be fine. But a lot of it is smoke and mirrors because it provides cover for a lot of nonsense.
Thank you.
Sure.
George, can I chime in on that real quick?
Yeah. Hi.
Oh, hi. This is something I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm so glad that question was asked, and I'm like so excited to hear people talk about it. I had a super traditional design education, and I'm right now working on thank you. I'm right now working on a curriculum to mentor formerly incarcerated people into learning design. And wow. It's been really interesting to try to dig past the quotes that I remember learning, the design of everyday things, like the books that like we all read. We have these quotes over and over, and really trying to dig deeper into Eurocentric thinking and designers. And I don't have a question to ask or really much to add, except that I'm excited to hear you talk about it. And it's something that's been super top of mind for me to unlearn some of what I've learned. And I was talking to my mom on the phone about it recently, about how there's been more coding resources for people of color, for formerly incarcerated people, for increasing access to coding, and not enough, but there's been some. And that's not the case for design. And my mom was like, well, don't you like have to have something to be a designer? Like, doesn't it have to be natural? And I was like, that's the problem, is like, it's not what you think design is. It's like, sure, maybe some, anyways. So I'm happy to hear you talk about it. And if anyone wants to talk to me about it more, chat me, look for me. I'm happy to talk more.
Thanks, Nicole. I mean, I feel like we could, maybe this is the rest of the conversation for the night. There's a really good article that one of our team put in forward to me. Her name, my director of operations name is Christina Cosillo, but she put in forward to the team this article that was written by a lady called Sylvia Harris, who to me I was not familiar with her at all. She's actually an AIGA medalist. She's one of the very, very few AIGA medalists who have ever been of color, who have also been female. The majority is, you know, old dead white guys. But Sylvia Harris wrote this piece. It's like a very slim, almost like a chapter within a larger piece around something called the Black aesthetic. And the phrasing of the title and the very idea that there might be one is to highlight the fact that there is such a paucity of options that refer to anything that is standard good design, that deviates from norms of European male centricity, is so limited in the number of examples. They all become either tokenized or more likely treated as like a one-off. What we've simply done is we've obliterated any examples of them. And because of how few there are, we end up in this weird loop to thinking, well, there can't have been anybody else who did it. So when you think about sort of like history of design, and particularly problematic is when you have people like Debbie Millman do a review of the history of graphic design and then never mention anybody other than the classics that we just talked about. one could perpetuate the idea that, well, there is no other examples other than the ones that are known, which to a degree has, well, I just simply say it's very limited value, because I think it gets purported as being canon when actually it's just a narrow band. And it's something that has taken me a long time to sort of like process, because so much of what I grew up thinking about was trying to be a typographer. My God, typography is the most gate-kept design discipline of all the disciplines. There's such dicks about this, because there's such a heightened vocabulary around what it takes to be a typographer. Have you ever noticed there's a direct correlation with how advanced how particular the vocabulary is to how limited the accessibility to that discipline will be. So typography is like a perfect hotbed for exclusivity and gatekeeping. So in that regard, what I noticed was that I had grown up thinking how awesome David Carson was. This like really experimental typographer in the 90s. And then Sylvia Harris's piece, she makes an argument that actually a lot of the work that he was referencing that were from Black designers looked edgy because it was coming from a place that wasn't the centered norm, that his reputation by, I would argue, appropriating those aesthetic styles gave him a type of edge that when in the sort of normalized European model, he looked really new and radical. That kills me because of how much I like held him up to be a real rule breaker, and realizing he just aped it. He's just aping work done by other people. And because you don't associate him with any other precedent, you think that he is like fully realized as a human being magical. And that perpetuates the norm that your mum, Nicole, talked about, which is that you were born with this. You're not, you're taught it. And I think depending on who you get taught from and what they teach you, can really determine whether or not you perpetuate this idea of you're born with or not. Man, we could talk about this all night long. Where do we start now? Oh, there's so much going on. There's so many comments. I can't keep up with all this.
Good questions in there too. I'm torn between, I know you have a few more slides, but there's also great conversation, everyone.
Well, I do want to maybe transition to the second section, if that's okay. So Natalie, I'm like nervous to have you do the screen share. Oh, look at that, there we go. Yeah, it's working. So one thing I might want to note is that for all of you who work at places, and even if you do work at places, but you actually own your organizations, Natalie, can you go back to one slide back over? Because there is a slight difference between how, if you go back one more, these interpersonal scale questions are phrased. What entity do you claim? What's placed in you did you earn? If you look at the next slide now, Natalie, I've rephrased them for your organizations. I think it's important that you write these down and ask them of yourselves and check with your team when you go back to your regular lives. What identity do we claim? What identity was placed on us? What identity did we earn? Whether that is working for a bank, whether that's working for a food school district, whether that's working for a nonprofit. These things are operating at the organizational level as well as the ones that we just tackled with. It is completely happening. So if you do work at a nonprofit or you do work at a bank, there are enormous expectations of what that bank or nonprofit is meant to do that you would then be pushing back against or rallying against or confounding or perpetuating when you are doing your work. And you not being aware of it is in the same sort of frustrating way that others will see when you say, hey, I'm this kind of person, but everybody sees you in this particular box. It is helpful that you are aware of that potential dichotomy. Okay, let's go to the next section then. So this will be probably the last one for the night. Privilege and context. If you go to the next slide, I think it's helpful to think about privilege because I think it's a absolutely heightened topic area. We see it show up in so many different ways from Amy Cooper. Do you guys remember Amy Cooper? It was only last week or 2 weeks ago. That seems like 3 years ago now. That lady, what was so fascinating about that little clip of video was watching how intimately, like with scalpel-like precision, she knew exactly how to use a privilege, and she knew exactly how to weaponize it in a way that I think other people could have intimated, but to see it on tape was actually kind of like played out in real time. How this particular phenomena can be so destructive. But at the same time, I think it's helpful to certainly be a little more aware of what it is. So I wanted to write a little description. If you look at the next slide, I want to give a definition for privilege to say it is a gift, the next slide, that you did nothing to earn. I want us to be more aware of the nature in which privilege shows up, because I think it's helpful to understand it is something that was given to you in many cases, but that you may not even know it's there until someone who doesn't have it spots it. They may be the only people to tell you the privileges you have, because our awareness of it might be driven by a certain level of opacity or ignorance, willful or otherwise, that you may not even realize is present because you've always had it, you've never questioned it. But those who don't have that same privilege in the context in which it happens might be the best people to be able to kind of give you that awareness. And I think when somebody calls it out, perhaps one of the automatic more knee-jerk reactions is to be upset about it, but I think it's such a valuable lesson because they're finally showing you something that others could always see, but that we have tried to either ignore or just simply was opaque to us. If you go to the next slide, I want to actually do the next slide again. Reference a few of these phrases that I often hear in design, but I think this is also true of like a lot of industries that are often male dominated, which is every industry. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. Lean in, move fast and break things, go big or go home. These are so common and they're so commonly used, at least when I was at IDEO, that I remember thinking, oh, this was meant to be encouraging. This was meant to be a way of reminding me like, I should be bold. What I don't think I realized until giving these talks is just how dripping in privilege these phrases are. These phrases assume that I am able to take the kind of risk that the person giving this advice has. Because the people who give this advice almost to a T are able-bodied straight white males, North American with American accents and a big. And when they tend to give this advice, they may assume everybody else has the ability to get away with all the same shit that I have done. That's not always true. And when I don't act on these advice, I get dinged as being not innovative enough, when they may not actually have factored in the fact that I can't afford to take those risks. I'm already leaning in. I can't lean much more than 45 degrees. And to tell me that I need to lean in more is an insult. So if you go to the next slide, it's helpful to think about privilege, if you go to the next slide, not only in the phrase of it's a gift, but also the way in which it pays off. You go to the next slide and the next slide again, because it's helpful to understand the context of this next slide, that the benefits from that privilege pay out at different times in different places. I think we heard from Pauline actually how maybe perhaps Pauline, if that's okay to reference you described going from one context to another. I think it's maybe helpful to recognize that your privileges may have like come into play in different places depending on the privilege, depending on the context. I know having gone from England to America, my privileges are different, and then different again when I go back to Burma. Completely different context provides a different way of interpreting and accessing the privilege that, again, I might not have been aware of until it gets spotted for me. So if you go to the next slide, I actually want to kind of do a quick inventory of all the privileges that I have, that I had that were gifts to me, that others may be able to see that I can't until I did this kind of full-blown analysis, and I still don't think it's enough. Can you go to the next slide? So the privileges I have: I'm 43, I'm male, I'm cisgendered, heterosexual, neurotypical, able-bodied, extroverted. My childhood is mostly trauma-free, and I have a British accent. So let's see about the context in which this pays out. So judgment is often deferred to me because of my age and because I don't have any hair. People just assume, oh, I must have gone through things, so I have experience. Patriarchy offers me a nearly unlimited leadership roles, and every time I turn it down, another one just shows up instead. Totally fine. Because I'm cisgendered, I'm accepted for the sex organs I was assigned at birth without any question. Who I'm attracted to is supported and protected by law. Imagine that. I'm free of any side effects from medication because of my neurotypicality. I'm able-bodied, so environments are uncovered for my physical mobility. And because I'm extroverted, that's just the sort of way I have been, verbal processing is rewarded and encouraged, and in fact seen as being someone who is a leader. Because my childhood is mostly trauma-free, I spend little time with coping strategies from the past trauma, and my words carry a certain gravitas that I know others, if they said exactly the same words, would not carry the same weight. Do you see how I am practically unable to fail? I'd have to work really, really hard to sabotage my career at this point. to see how this works. That's kind of, I mean, that's partly why I'm given this status as a speaker today. I mean, I'm awesome, but I'm also have all this as well. To see how this works. There are people who have better content than me, but don't have this type of benefit that you will never see on this stage. That kills me. So for the exercise, if we dare go to a breakout room again, if you go to the next slide, I'd like for all of us to try and see if you can take an inventory of your own personal unearned privileges. These are the ones that you were gifted as opposed to ones that you worked really, really hard for. I don't discount they exist. I'm not asking about that. I'm just trying to see if we can get an inventory of those gifted privileges, because if you aren't aware of them, other people who know you definitely see them, and it's our like lack of familiarity with it that may be holding us back. Maybe, Natalie, I'm wondering if perhaps we don't do the breakout rooms and we just kind of take a minute or so to, let's just like 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, we can
quietly
do that.
working on. And you know, if you want to take a second, turn off your camera, because I know how like exhausting it can be to have your camera on the whole time. But let's do it. Natalie, do you mind keeping a timer? Let's do 3 minutes to do an inventory. And actually, if you could also go back to the slide with the examples of what I wrote.
Yes. Go back. Oh, sorry. Give it away. This one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see examples that I wrote just to kind of see if you can keep track of them.
All right. I'm going to start a timer now. So 3 minutes on the clock, and they're going to do this for themselves. And please put yourself on mute. Thank you. If you're not, George.
I'm going to try to catch up all these. So many comments in the chat. My God.
All right, it's been 3 minutes, so we can come back.
And we were about 10 minutes away from the end of this lovely session that we've had together. why don't we speak for maybe 7-8 minutes before wrapping things up?
Do you want slides anymore, or do you want to look at faces?
Faces, please. Thank you, Natalie.
I will stop sharing if I can.
So rather than having actually people like call out their own privileges, I think that can be kind of a tough question. I'm just curious to know if folks had any reflection about the exercise, what it felt like to do the inventory. Was there anything on that list that you felt surprised by or knew all along? I'm just curious to hear any sort of reflection upon what it felt like just to do that rundown.
I have, sorry.
Go ahead, Kate.
I was just going to say that I had some that I have a pretty clear list, but I also at times had some that based on like, you know, the fact that I'm a woman can also be a double-edged sword. Like, so similar to you, I could put my age, like maybe people think that I'm more of an authority, but it also works against you as a woman.
Yeah, mine doesn't go down ever. Mine just keeps escalating every year I go by. So mine's a one-way street on that regard, at least in terms of credibility. It doesn't diminish until you hit like a really, really late plateau. But I don't think that's true for women. I think you end up getting screwed over a lot as from what I've seen, as that goes up. I don't think that's very equitable at all. Was there someone else?
Yeah, it was me. I think it was interesting because on like a normal day.
Tell us your name.
Oh, I'm Tass.
Hi.
Sorry. It was interesting because on a normal day, I think of myself as a very privileged person, given that I work in design and like I do all of these things and I live in Brooklyn. I'm like this Brooklyn designer person. But when I'm writing stuff down, I realize that a lot of the things I have is things I've earned. So it's interesting to like try to find things that weren't given to me rather than were given to me. And like Kate said, like things that I feel like might be a privilege might also be a disadvantage in a way as well. So that was also just an interesting insight that I gained from this exercise.
What's an example of that?
I wrote that I am skinny, which is like it like depends on which world I turn to. Like I've always been like very easily skinny. Like I didn't have to like work for it, which is definitely a privilege. But like that could also like have ways that are not like people in my like immigrant community definitely look down on it and like always point it out and point out your weight and make you feel bad. But that's, I feel like very specific to like not an American specific culture. So it's also interesting, like there are privileges that I have in my specific culture that are not privileges in like an American culture or vice versa.
Yeah, my mom is constantly monitoring my weight. I have no idea why.
Yeah, it's like the first question is, have you eaten?
Yeah, or like, oh, you've eaten too much. Like you've put on weight. Like, why are you telling me this? Why are we talking about this at all? Can we just get to the conversation? Like, why is that the first thing you have to tell me?
Yeah.
I don't know why that is the case, but that is a very constant phenomenon, at least from my parents. Did you put your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to jump in and on that conversation and say, like, you know, I've experienced definitely a similar thing from family, and then looking at again what comes from the Indian side as privilege and then what comes from the American side as privilege in my situation, and how if I look at it from the Indian side, I'm fairly light-skinned. Whereas if I look at it from the American side, I'm nowhere near white passing. So looking at it in those two different ways, it's just, yeah, it's a bit of a challenge to see, you know, is that earned privilege? Is that unearned privilege? Is that something, I'm not sure how to classify those things because you have these two different sides of it that are coming in.
Do you not think it's worth actually highlighting just how happenstance and bullshit all of this is? Are we not actually highlighting it's just fiction? It's true that the phenomena that each of us carry and the ways in which our characteristics show up physically and mentally and everything else. But if the context is that fragile, surely all of it is bullshit.
Yeah, definitely.
surely the idea that there should be any difference going from one street to the other or one country to the other actually highlights how nonsense this is. It's worth arguing that yes, you have to be aware of it, but I don't want to elevate it to say that it is forever the only thing it can be. It's bullshit. Because it's so completely out of our control, but also nonsense that anybody should be judged on any of these things at all. I don't want to ignore it because that would be dangerous. I mean, a number of people who are people of color who live in this country constantly aware of their status and actually the status in relationship to other people, particularly white women, where the slightest implication that there is going to be fear given by their presence can lead to death. Very, very valid. At the same time, it's all nonsense that the fact that we have to play these games is like both depressing but also relevant. And if we try to like navigate our way through white America, which many of us are forced to do, is worth sort of both recognizing sort of the game we play, but also how broken it is. I don't want to pretend that it's not. I don't want to get better. You know, there's a phrase a friend of mine gave me, which is like, we are becoming masters of a broken system. There's like value in becoming good at it, but I don't want to become so blind to the fact that it is corrupt in the first place. It has to be called out for its inherent wrongness, and we can still learn to play it. I just don't want to lose sight of how broken it is in the first place. Now I'm just ranting. We're down to the last few minutes. I so appreciate and just love how many beautiful faces I'm seeing on this video call. It's so great. Natalie, if I can maybe ask for the slides for one last time. We're going to just like rush to the very last slide if you can, and put up a question for everyone. Maybe just go through to the end. And it's a very simple request. Yeah, this is it. Thank you. Can everyone please take a look at the calendars, either on their phones or on their laptops, and find the next moment where power asymmetry is present? It could be in the next 24 hours. It could be the next week. You could be at the wide end. You could be at the sharp end. But I want to try and see if we can highlight a moment of asymmetry that is upcoming. And I would be surprised if you can't find one, because I think everybody, now that we've talked about it, will be able to go, yep, that one right there. That one's coming up right there. Fuck, I'm already dreading it. It's tangible. You know when that's going to come up. Now, if you're on the sharp end or the wide end, I'm going to encourage a simple piece of advice, which is, what can we do to disrupt it? I can't give you that advice because I don't have enough time to kind of go through your particular context, but I want us to be asking of it and maybe even checking with someone else. Hey, this thing that's coming up, is there anything we can do to like change it? That could be a peer, it could be your roommate, it could be your boss. I think it's worth just checking to see how can we change the disrupted like norms that this thing is likely to play out, because we know that if it's set up this way, it's not going to be great. And I think just asking those questions foundationally will help us understand what is our relationship to power and do we have to play the game that way. So with that poignant rhetorical device, I would love to wrap up the evening and just give everyone a huge thanks for your support and your dialogue and your candor through this amazingly candid conversation, despite there being so many people on this call and despite the interruption that Zoom threw us and Natalie under the bus. Natalie, I thought you handled that very, very well. So thanks for sort of being there for part one and part two. I'm just feeling a lot of, I'm feeling actually kind of emotional. This has been really lovely to kind of get into this kind of level of dialogue with everyone. Please be kind to each other during this time. And I think that's kind of it. I think we're done. Natalie, how should we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I just, again, thank you everyone for your candid conversation and really investing in talking about this. I think there's interest to have more of these conversations. So there were a lot of people who wanted to attend, and I think, again, we can host more conversation like this. So George, we can talk offline more about that. But thank you everyone for coming and bringing yourselves. I feel emotional about it too, and especially with the disruption in the middle, and we got 60 people to come back despite it all. It goes to show people really want to be having these conversations. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to end it. I'll put the recordings together and share so you can look at that. We will have an article as well about this. So yeah, we'll share all the resources afterward, but thank you again so much for coming this evening. And you can reach us through Meetup if you have questions, discussion board work. So thanks, everyone.
Wonderful.
Sharing.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Have a good one.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I wanted to see who'd be last. I'll end it for everyone now. It's always so abrupt. So bye. Have a